In this critical hour, we make a historical declaration. Trampling on the Warsaw Pact, the Russian hordes have launched a perfidious attack against Budapest and several other cities in the country. Hungarian soldiers are fighting as one man against the invaders.
On November 11, 1956, Soviet troops crushed the short-lived Hungarian Revolution. In one of the first breaks in the Iron Curtain, peasants, students, and workers fought Russian tanks in the streets of Budapest, hoping to become independent from Soviet control. Their revolution was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. The Hungarians of 1956 became an inspiration for freedom fighters throughout the communist world. With the resolution of the First World War, Hungary became an independent country. Abusing the nation's instability, fascist dictator Miklos Horthy seized control of the government. He retained power until Nazi occupation during World War II. Hungary was liberated by the Red Army. With its freedom came the shadow of the Soviet Union. At the close of the Second World War, the continent was divided between the victors. Led by brutal dictator Joseph Stalin, the Communist Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe, while Western Europe remained capitalist. The two sides were separated into the bloodless conflict known as the Cold War. In the East, the Soviet Union coerced its neighboring countries into the Warsaw Pact under the pretense of creating national equality. The reality was closer to Soviet imperialism. In Hungary, there was a brief period of government freedom and a multi-party system. Eventually, anti-Soviet politicians were jailed, and opposition parties began to disband. By 1948, the Soviet Communist Party had eliminated its opponents and seized control of the government. In 1952, Mátyás Rákosi became the premier of Hungary's Communist Party. Essentially, Rákosi had complete control of the country. He was fiercely loyal to the Soviet Union and used the Hungarian secret police, the AVO, to intimidate and arrest dissidents.
Since 1948, the Soviets and the Soviet, let's call it the puppet government since 1948, Rákosi and the others, have been trying to reinvent Hungary as a Soviet-style country. It really wasn't.
Rákosi upended the economy by forcing Hungarian farmers into an industrial society. All private businesses were merged into collectives.
My dad had been a small businessman. The communists took his business away. And he had to work on his own machines in the factory. They took his tool and die making equipment, put it into a factory, and then made him work on his own equipment and part of the collective.
On March 5th, 1953, Imre Nagy replaced Rákosi as premier. Nagy steered away from the industrial economy. He also allowed peasants to leave the collectives or renegotiate their terms. Nagy made efforts to abolish prison camps within Hungary and protect people from the secret police. His actions gave him wild popularity, especially among the young. In 1955, Nagy was forced out of the government by the Hungarian Communist Party. Power fell into the hands of its leader, Ernő Járo. Elsewhere, the irritation with Soviet policy was growing. On October 21, 1956, the Polish Communist Party distanced themselves from the oppressive Soviet control.
In June of 1956, there was a rebellion in Poland, in Poznan, where workers suffering from a new line of collectivization, industrialization, but especially low wages and a lack of bread, really this lack of bread and freedom that caused them to revolt in June of 1956.
On October 22nd, sparks of dissent began in Hungary during a routine Soviet rally. Members of Budapest Potofi Riders Club took control of the crowd and demanded to address the situation in Poland. They drafted a list of 14 reforms in order to reclaim their culture. These became the backbone of the revolution. Empowered, the crowd marched through the night to Parliament Square. They demanded for the upheaval of their government, the appearance of Nagy, and the establishment of their 14 points. Nagy appeared, but it was clear he was being used by Járo to calm the crowd. The crowd left unsatisfied and marched to Budapest radio station to broadcast their demands. They shouted, "Ruszkik Haza," or "Russians go home." Without warning, an AVO attachment inside the building fired on the crowd. Hungarian soldiers were called in to control the protesters. Instead of shooting, the soldiers handed over their weapons. The revolution had begun.
I have been witness today to one of the great events of history. I have seen the people of Budapest catch the fire lit in Poznan and Warsaw and come into the streets in open rebellion against their Soviet overlords. I have marched with them and almost wept for joy with them as the Soviet emblems and the Hungarian flags were torn out by angry and exalted crowds.
In cities and villages all over Hungary, people rose up against the Soviet Union and the AVO. Erno Gero, fearful of the uprising, called in Soviet reinforcements, appointed Noj premier, and fled the country. Armed groups of workers, students, and the Hungarian military, many younger than 16, roamed the streets of Budapest, fighting skirmishes with AVO units and Soviet forces. Hungarian revolutionaries shot fearlessly at professional soldiers, littering uniform after uniform with small arms fire. Students pushed back tanks with homemade Molotov cocktails and nitroglycerin bombs made in college chemistry labs. Anti-fascist resistance fighters from World War II stormed the Szabad newspaper and reclaimed it in the name of Hungary. In Spell, a working-class neighborhood of Budapest, workers overtook a detachment of 250 Soviet troops and reclaimed their steel factory. To combat the siege conditions, peasant farmers on the countryside sent truckloads of food in support of their fellow Hungarians. In a dramatic show of resistance, the revolting crowds tore down the city's massive statue of Stalin. The revolutionaries ripped the Soviet insignia from the Hungarian flag, leaving a hole where communism once stood. Hungarian culture, which had been oppressed under Soviet control, flourished during these first days of revolution. The writers of the Potofi Club quickly circulated their works around the globe as a counter to Soviet propaganda. This brief explosion of culture united the people of Hungary and aimed to inspire Western aid. Sadly, the West was distracted by the U.S. election and the Suez Canal crisis. Help would never arrive. By October 28th, a new, more democratic government had emerged, promising free elections, disbanding the AVO, and freeing all political prisoners. Noj returned as a leader and propelled his country farther and farther away from Soviet control. On November 1st, Hungary withdrew from the Warsaw Pact. While in peace negotiations, the Soviets sent thousands of soldiers and tanks into Hungary. The revolution was crushed. Noj was tried and executed in secret. Many more Hungarians were killed, arrested, or deported. Over 200,000 people fled the country as refugees. With the rebellion silenced, the Soviets installed a new puppet government. Hungary would not be free of Soviet troops until 1991. The revolution exposed the weakness of the Soviet Union. They had created a system that could not bend, and when the Hungarians challenged it, it broke. The revolution established that a determined people could take a stand against an international superpower. In these 13 days, the youth who began the revolution gave Eastern Europe a glimpse of freedom and set the stage for future rebellion against communism.
1956, and the memory of 1956, led to the rebellion in 1968. And the uprising, the Prague Spring of 1968, led directly to 1989, the revolt of 1989, the Velvet Revolution, and the fall of communism in Eastern Europe.
Although the revolution was ultimately a failure, it exposed the true brutality of the Soviet Union. The Hungarian people took a stand for their rights as a nation, as a people, and as human beings.
This was a moment of great courage, and I don't think that should be underestimated. Even though it failed, it doesn't matter. The fact that they revolted against the Soviet Union at all in 1956 is itself commendable. I mean, it's heroic. It's one of the reasons why it still resonates all the way till today.
The revolution of 1956 defined the Hungarian people in a very, very, very strong way. And very honestly, 1956 ripped the mask off of Soviet aggression and what communism really meant. And so it ended up as the beginning of, many of us believe, the end of communism. Because that was, the communist parties all over Europe turned their backs on the Soviet Union at that point.
Those Hungarian students and workers and women and fighting children have done more to close the future of communism than armies of diplomats. They have exposed the brutal hypocrisy of communism. They have torn its mask off. We owe them pride and praise, for their defeat has been itself a triumph.